Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Camille Moore with Connect, and I'd like to thank you for tuning in to What If You Change One Thing with Brian Avery. Before we get started, we have just a few housekeeping notes on the platform. You can type in your questions for Brian in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen or via the chat box on the right-hand side of your screen. We'd love for this to be an interactive session, so please send in questions throughout the webinar. At the bottom of the screen, you will notice several widgets, which include one with the handout of today's presentation. Please be sure to download that if you would like. A recorded version of this session will be available on demand on our website, where you can find additional on-demand webinars for any of you needing last-minute credit hours before CMP testing. Yes, you are able to watch our sessions on demand and still receive credits. For everyone joining us live today, the CMP credit for this webinar is still pending approval from the EIC. Once the credit is approved, we will email your certificate. For any of you future viewers watching this session on demand and not live, please email me directly at cmore@connectmeetings.com to receive your certificate. I'll share more information about our upcoming webinars at the end of the program, but let's go ahead and get started. I'd like to thank Providence Warwick for sponsoring today's session. They have provided a video to share about its destination. Here is Providence, Rhode Island.
High summer here in Rhode Island, land of perfect sun, sand, and surf. How great does Providence look? Thank you again, Providence Warwick. Before I introduce Brian, you'll notice a map on your screen about our upcoming events. If you have any questions, please contact my coworker, Kristen Francis, at kfrancis@connectmeetings.com. I'll go ahead and I will type in her email address. Now, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Brian Avery. Brian is an advocate for safety and communicating the importance of improving personal safety and organizational awareness. Direct from the pages of Brian's reports, his experience, and research, Brian shares the lessons learned from tragic yet avoidable incidents and hazards that he has investigated worldwide, all in an effort of prevention and progress. Brian D. Avery is a life safety speaker, professor, expert witness, and author who specializes in protecting the people that compromise the events, tourism, and attractions industries. Brian's career spans 25-plus years, and his background is comprised of 3 areas of expertise: risk and safety management, event design, and execution and education. Brian, welcome. Thank you so much for sharing with us today.
Thank you, Camille, for the excellent introduction. I appreciate that. I'm looking forward to speaking with everyone here today on the topic of event and hospitality risk management and safety considerations. My presentation, What If You Changed One Thing, has a very specific objective, providing basically a five-step roadmap to safer meetings and events. So, as I progress through the presentation today, I will do my best to keep up with the chat box. Sometimes I can get a little distracted and things of that nature, so I'll do my best to monitor and answer any specific questions that might come up while speaking. So, just based on the title alone, what if you changed one thing? I'm basing this on a concept called multi-causative effects, where, multiple situations usually lead up to an incident or an accident. And it is our objective as event and meeting planners, or anybody for that matter that's involved in organization, business, things to that effect, to identify what are considered known and foreseeable hazards and remove them. If I could give you an example per se, say you were working in a kitchen, and you had an individual that might have been washing dishes or something, and he was allowed to work that particular day, even though he had brought the wrong tennis shoes to work. They were not anti-slip. And there might have been a rule specific to you cannot work without your anti-slip shoes, but because they were hard up for employees, they went ahead and made an exception. So, imagine the kitchen manager or chef or someone calls for pans, and there had been a spill earlier on the floor in the general vicinity where they were working. The individual, instead of using a cart or something to that effect, decides to pick up a bunch of the pans and, proceed to the kitchen, doesn't see the grease spill, has the balding shoes, and next thing you know, upends and has an injury as a result. The objective here is to identify just one element, just one of those, and remove it. And then the hope is, or the theory is, that the incident would not occur. So that's kind of what the premise of today's discussion is. And as I walk you through it, if you've got questions, like I said, please let me know, and I'll do my best to answer them. So a little bit about me. I think that you get a broad understanding of my background from the introduction. But, I've been working in this industry for, well, my father would say since I was about 4 years old. I would argue when I was about 14 when I had my first job in the business. But I was my father's little inspector at Busch Gardens in Tampa, Florida, back in the 70s in the hospitality industry. So he was the first ever safety manager at Tampa, Florida, at Busch Gardens. And he's taught me quite a bit about what I know in this business, but I have morphed into a lot of different fields and backgrounds since then. As he would put it, I've got cotton candy in my blood at this point. I wouldn't dispute it, considering how long I've been in the business. But I'm approaching 30 years in the industry. Currently, I'm a professor at the University of Florida in Gainesville, Florida. So I noticed there's quite a few West Coast people out there. Welcome. And I noticed that there was an individual from Orlando that had chimed in. That was my hometown for about 30 years, so I was in the thick of things with respect to the events and tourism industry. But since then, like I said, I've been teaching as an academic in this industry, creating coursework and content and risk management concerns with respect to events and meeting planning. So outside of that, though, one of my primary focuses as a event expert witness, so individuals that have been injured as a result of negligence, attending different locations throughout the country. I have testified on behalf of those individuals in determining, which party has wronged them. I see that some people are having some difficulty hearing me. I do have my volume as loud as it can go, so maybe it's something on the other end that can be adjusted. And I do have the phone headset right up to my
Yes.
mouth.
I will check on the audio, everyone.
All right, perfect. So I'll do my best to get a little louder, but that's difficult for me sometimes. Outside of that, like I said, I was describing that I act as an expert witness and have been involved in about 150 cases in the last 10 years. where people have been injured as a result of attending an event or a meeting situation that has not been handled clearly or perfectly. So I'm going to kind of walk through a few of those situations, use them as a point of reference, and go from there as we progress. I do have some people that say they can hear me loud and clear, so that is a good sign. Maybe we're making some progress in this regard. But outside of that, I'm going to ask that you guys kind of escape wherever you are, your locations, and take a trip with me to Cozumel. I'm sure some of you have been to that area of the world. It can be a wonderful experience. So, you know, in this regard, though, this was a trip of a lifetime, so to speak. There was a young gentleman by the age of 22 that was going to be taking a trip with some of his buddies on a singles cruise. You know, they had planned this trip, saved quite a bit of money. This was going to be a big deal for them. So they get down to Cozumel, and they had a smattering of options of excursions that they could select from. So basically, they had selected going to a popular hotspot on the island called Señor Frogs. And, you know, once they got to port, they were going to participate in a all-you-can-drink you know, form of debauchery, if you get where I'm coming from, at Señor Frogs. So, you know, this was planned by an event planner, someone who had contracted with Carnival Cruise Lines, which was the ship that they were operating off of. And, you know, there was quite a few agreements in place, and, you know, this event planner had secured the venue and everything in between, and it put the description of the actual event together and made all the arrangements to bring them from the ship actually to Señor Frogs, which was where the shore excursion was going to occur. So while they're there, it's a 4 hours, you know, 4 hour all-you-can-drink type of event, which in and of itself, you know, doesn't seem so harmless. You know, alcohol and events seem to go hand in hand, but at what form? I think that's very important to understand that we know as an industry that alcohol is a problem in certain elements or aspects, and therefore we should do more to curb you know, the concerns that might result from misuse or overuse, you know, or having over-beveraged guests, as some would say. But nonetheless, they're participating in this particular event, and, you know, they're right near the sidewall, the ocean. They see an opportunity to dive repeatedly off of the seawall into the waterways. And it doesn't seem like it's a prohibited activity because there's a slide that's offset to the side that people are using, albeit inappropriately. And nonetheless, you know, through continued use, a couple hours in, very hot sun, extensive drinking, and an event planner who is leading the charge in this regard, essentially was encouraging this continued behavior of using the environment in an inappropriate manner. Never checked with the restaurant or what the policies of the island or anything to that effect were with respect to being in that waterway or jumping off of that seawall. In fact, at this point, you know, this event planner was leading the charge. As you can see, there's a photo of the individual in that bottom right corner. He's wearing a white cowboy hat. And at this point, you know, this young man, this 22-year-old, who was on the, you know, trip of a lifetime, had jumped in to the water head first, and next thing you know, he had broken his neck. His friends thought he was messing around. Next thing you know, he was floating on the surface, and they had determined within about 2 to 3 minutes that, you know, he had broken his neck or back or something to that effect. So he was, you know, airlifted from that location to Houston, and then from Houston to New York, which is where he was from. And unfortunately, they determined that he was a quadriplegic as a result of the failure for the event planner to communicate specific requirements of the location, or to even identify what those requirements were. It was prohibited to be jumping off the seawall. There was multiple people involved that were sued in the end with respect to this matter. And, you know, essentially the event planner had an obligation to supervise, and some people would say they're babysitters at some level once the event starts, which I know seems like a derogatory term, but it is really our responsibility to continuously monitor the activities of all of those participants, patrons that we invite onto our properties for a specific purpose or reason. So the objective is, while they're there on that property as a guest, based on the plan or event that was envisioned, we have a responsibility to maintain their safety. So, there are questions that have to ask. There's site inspections that need to be conducted. There's policies and procedures that need to be reviewed. There's concepts that need to be communicated, and there's parameters that need to be established in order for, the individuals to abide by. So in this particular instance, this young man didn't receive any of that information because the event planner failed to coordinate any of it, ask for it, to ensure that what they were permitting was even permissible. So this young kid, like I said, who's now a quadriplegic, is going to spend the rest of his life basically in a bed or a wheelchair with assistance. Now, they did sue, and as you can see in this next slide, the verdict was substantial. It was a $55 million verdict in favor of the plaintiff because of a failure of the event planner to do their job. Now, there was other parties involved, like I said, having responsibilities in the overall concept of the event, but these things can be very costly, and it could happen to anyone is really what I'm suggesting at a moment's notice, especially if we aren't taking charge of the policies and procedures that should be in place to ensure the safety of others, because it is, after all, our obligation to follow exacting standards, things that we know in the industry that can occur when we do miss specific requirements to comply with either laws, regulations, standards, or just common practices that are there in the industry. So, the liability policies on this were $1 million with a $2 million aggregate. They paid out of pocket in addition to that because they actually decided to take this to court. So this is a big deal in our business, and I know it seems like an outlier, and the odds are that this is not something that's going to happen to you on this scale, but you never know. And the key here is to always be on the lookout, always be scanning the environment and making a determination: am I in compliance? Am I doing enough? Are there standards that exist? What are those policies and procedures, and should I be reviewing mine? Have I read them lately, and am I enforcing them at some level? So, but nonetheless, this is a failure to do their job, and there was significant consequences associated with it, as we've discussed. So, a lot of times when we have guests that come to our properties, we invite them. You can throw logic out the window. They're there to escape. Maybe the environment we've created is a form of escapism. Maybe it's an immersive experience or something to that effect. And as a result, we have to ensure that we rein them in, monitor them constantly. Like I said, I know it's derogatory at some level, but to babysit them at some level, because we did invite them, we did create the event, so therefore we must control it as we've envisioned it. Because others might not understand what it is that we have created in the way it was supposed to be used. So we have to make sure that it's very logical for all involved in a way of following it at some level. So outside of that, another story to share with you. Like I said, I was going to share a couple. This has to do with the Special Olympics, and this occurred up in the Connecticut region. And unfortunately, during the torch run, an individual was severely, or multiple people were severely injured, but one very specifically. So I've got a question here. In your story with the young man, if the event planner sent out a document explaining a general list of do's and don't, including no swimming except an approved location, would they still be found guilty? That was one of the primary findings of it, that there was no content provided one way or the other with respect to what the requirements of the attendees and or patrons for this particular event were. So it was very important that in the future, if you're developing an event, you clearly outline what the requirements of the event are, that they would not have been able to put find them negligent for this particular act or the lack of actually addressing the situation. So that's a great question. But getting back to the torch run, what had occurred is that an individual, running in the torch run, the race, and there were 3 specific torches that were being used, and they were being passed off intermittently as obviously the fuel, the wick, was burning out. So in the back of a pickup truck, someone had created an idea that we would maintain the fuel, carry the fuel, keep it whatever, refuel, and then relight the actual wicks, and then hand them back off to the runners during the race or the torch run itself. So one of the torches broke during this process, and during this process, next thing you know, they were relighting another one of the torches, and the fuel from the torch that had broke had made its way to the bed of the truck, and because it was Coleman fuel from camp fuel, unfortunately it was clear and it couldn't be seen, so the individual lit the back of the truck on fire. And unfortunately, in doing so, that person was lit on fire as well. Another one had suffered some minor injuries from the fire, but not to the extent of the person that was actually sitting in the back of the truck. So it seems like a no-brainer, and it's like, well, this is just absolutely logical. How did this even, or illogical, but logic would suggest this should have never occurred in any way, shape, or form. It's very common. You don't light things near fuel. But that was not the case in this particular instance. In fact, the driver of the pickup truck was an off-duty police officer, and they also had a fire marshal that was at the ready. They did not have a fire extinguisher, and they did not have any plans in place to address any potential negative effects that would come from this process. So the woman suffered significant burns as a result. There were no policies and procedures in place from the organization that had put this on. They never even considered the basics, and the basics would be read the back of the camp fuel can for particular instructions with respect to how and can we use this, and what environment should we be doing it, and can we light it near, where we're fueling. Should this even be stored in the same vicinity? So it had all the answers to this, and it's a basic, either on the can or actually through the use of what's called a material safety data sheet, which OSHA requires in general industry for people to use. As you can see, there's warnings on the front of that can that stipulate the extreme dangers associated. But if you look out on the back of the particular can, you're able to pull off, keep product away from high energy ignition sources, heat, sparks, pilot lights, static electricity, and open flame. So this was just a basic requirement that was not fulfilled, and as a result, a very negative consequence resulted. So, once again, it's find the one element that could ignite or cause this particular situation and remove it. Our job is to identify, like I said, the known and foreseeable hazards with respect to certain situations. We can't think of everything, obviously, that could occur or even imagine some of them, but through basic processes that we implement, we can learn to identify where the potential concerns might come from, and then therefore eliminate or mitigate those potential concerns. So, the key here is to know your role. And as the slide comes up, knowing your role. Do you have policies? Do you have procedures? Do you even know where to look for those? If you're not an expert in a particular subject matter or field, who do I reach out and have these conversations with? I mean, I don't believe anyone expects everybody to be all-knowing with respect to the development and creation of events, and or all the tributaries that can occur, when you are trying to put on an event that a subcontractor might be responsible for, or something that wasn't thought of that might be out of your wheelhouse but is, going to be on property or at your location. Do we know enough about it? Is it solid? Are there policies and procedures? Are there standards that exist? Did they receive training in this particular field? These are the type of questions we have to ask. I know some of us do have policies and procedures, but when's the last time you read them? And have you shared them with everyone? I mean, so if you're hosting an event and, you've hired volunteers, an example, but you failed to train your volunteers with respect to this content, you have a problem, because, if you're allowing or asking someone to work on your behalf for the event that you've created and invited individuals to attend, everybody involved that is providing the event or an element of the event should be in the know with respect to, how do we identify potential concerns and situations, and when they do arise, how do we deal with them? So The next phase is, as an event planner, meeting planner, we got to ask a series of questions of ourselves. And essentially, it's very simple. It's the 5 W's. It's the who, the what, the when, the where, the why. I created a blog about a year or so ago. It kind of sums all of this up in a very tight way. It's called Event Planning. All I Need to Know I Learned from a Birthday Invitation, where it answers all these 5 questions, essentially. But in essence, it's our role each and every time to ask these questions and document, what is the requirement, and how am I going to determine what my responsibility or role is in this particular requirement or situation. So, with respect to the why, it's easy. It's like, what is the purpose and the role of the meeting or event? Well, write it down, because in our industry, if it's not documented, especially from a legal perspective, it can be looked at as it wasn't done. So it's our responsibility to make sure that we can definitively go back and say, well, here is how it was defined, and here was the purpose and role of this particular event, and here's the process that we used that arrived at making sure that this was a safe and memorable situation. So the next thing is the who. It's very simple. Ask this question. It's like the audience and the stakeholders. Who are they? Please identify them. Make sure that we know their role in this environment, in this situation. So I know this seems pretty basic, but what I've noticed, during the 150 or so events, that, I've investigated with respect to, liability or negligence concerns, these things were not done. So sometimes I think it's good to go back to the basics and just and say, here's a process that we can use that arrive at a specific conclusion. And I'll get to the details or the nitty-gritty of this in a moment. The next is the when, obviously, the date and the duration of the event. I think that's probably the most easy, but what's the impact that might be as a result of selecting these particular events? Outside influences or situations that might impact it in some negative or a positive way, you never know. The where. Where is the location and the space? Is it appropriate for the type of event that I'm actually hosting? Is the capacity issue, being addressed? How much space am I going to have per person? Am I meeting the NFPA Life Safety Code 101 requirements for crowd supervisors or managers? And most know, or at least I hope they know, that for every 250 guests that you have to have one crowd certified manager or certified crowd person in attendance. And for every 250 additional guests you have to keep adding to that equation. And that is in the NFPA Life Safety Code requirements that's been adopted by almost every state in the country from a fire marshal's perspective. And if they're not adopted NFPA, they've adopted the International Fire Code. So, and these reside in both. But, this talks about spacing and capacity considerations and crowd concerns. The what is, what are the resources available? And desired outcomes of this particular event. I mean, if you're going to what is considered a non-purpose-built facility, how am I going to create an environment that is appropriate for the event in which I envision? What kind of resources am I going to rely on? What kind of contractors am I going to use to make sure that I achieve the desired outcomes with respect to the event that I'm actually envisioning? So this all boils down to a process that we've been teaching and I have been studying for years, and that's the MBOK model. I don't know, how many of you have heard of the MBOK model, but it is the event management body of knowledge, and essentially it's an internationally recognized framework for addressing the skills that are essential to create, develop, and deliver events. Now, there's other variations of this that you can see that MPI have put out and others. But this is just the general gist of you got to answer these specific questions in a very specific way with respect to design, administration, marketing, operation, and risk concerns. And obviously there's a clear process. It includes the assessment, identification of analysis, and this could be the resources or the location that you've selected. The selection of a property or the type of event that you're going to do, and what's the goal associated with it. It's the monitoring of that situation, the progress and the status. What's the timelines that you've set? Do you have a Gantt chart that you might be using or relying on to ensure that these processes are addressed in a timely manner, and who's doing it, and are they qualified to do so? And the communication consideration. I mean, communication is key in our industry. We have to continually be acquiring the information and then relaying it to the appropriate person at the right time, so that they can make an informed decision with respect to, well, what is it? I mean, we create these environments and we're controlling these environments per se. And sometimes people get to the environment, they really don't understand how they're supposed to interact or where they're supposed to be or things like that. Now, that doesn't apply to all events, but some of the larger events or larger meetings that might be out there, you got to find ways to communicate in an effective manner. And then obviously documenting what it is that you do. So at every level, if you, like I said before, if you don't document, it didn't happen. So document, so that in the event that something does occur later on down the road, you were able to prove that you did everything humanly possible to address the concern. So, and then ultimately, the goal is here is, what's your plan? What are you doing? How are you effectively addressing your concerns in the industry? What we've determined through a recent survey that MPI had been a part of is that 50% of meeting and event planners do not have a plan. But to further that, what we've also learned is that 80% of those that do not have a plan, after 2 years following a major catastrophic loss or incident, they've closed their doors as a result of this. And now, sometimes, like we're kind of honing in on it, you're not going to be able to identify each and every aspect that might arise. Because you just might not know. It might be something new that has occurred. It might be out of your wheelhouse, which isn't acceptable, but it does happen. But the goal here is through identification and creating some sort of plan to mitigate what it is that is known and foreseeable. But when that fails, how quickly are you going to react to it? What is your policy or procedure that you have in place to be responsive to whatever occurs, so that you respond in a timely fashion? Because if you don't, and say the media gets a hold of something that might have occurred on your property or something to that effect, and it looks like you don't know, someone else hijacks the message, and next thing writes your story, and yet it might be absolutely incorrect. So it's important to have reactive responses to situations, so that when something does occur, you're able to address it in a very timely manner, so that you can mitigate whatever potential concerns might arise as a result. So, one of the biggest problems we have in industry is we use a lot of vendors. Obviously, we need to rely on a lot of outside resources to create the events and the meetings and whatnot that we envision. But what is your process? And this is something where most people fall short, for vetting the vendors. What process are you relying on when you call a vendor or you're searching for a vendor to ensure, can they do what they say they can do? Are you relying on resources, or references, excuse me? Are you checking their insurance requirements? Are you identifying permits that they should have, or licenses? Are you asking to evaluate the training programs? Do you require that they have the manufacturer's manuals for the equipment that they're using, so that it gets installed per those manufacturer specifications? Do you require that they provide their own supervision? Do they apply those same requirements to the subcontractors that they use when they can't fill a call or a particular work order? How are you defining the scope? Are you continuously monitoring them? And I mean, as an example here, we have a tent, it's fairly large. What is their weather monitoring program for this? And what is the wind rating for that particular tent? And if there's a rainstorm the night before, are they going to come back and check the soil composition to make sure that the staking hasn't moved? Has it been staked according to the state regulations, so that it's capped and or no one could be injured as a result of coming in contact with the rebar that might be recessed in the ground at some level? So there's a lot to consider with respect to vetting your vendors. One of the key things is I think a lot of major organizations will create a vendor list, and they do it based pretty much on price. So they're cutting themselves short with respect to some key considerations that they might want to look into to ensure that they're getting a vendor that actually can do the job, even though they might be a little more expensive, but they're going to meet all of the specific requirements with respect to what your expectations might be, or should be anyways. So, when it comes to the events industry, the meetings world, what can go wrong? Well, I've got a list for you. Oops, skipped over that, sorry. There we go. Alcohol, which we talked about earlier, is a big problem in the industry, and ensuring that we have policies and procedures that match the dram shop laws for the state that you are working in. So understanding, how do we serve and how much do we serve, and are we using qualified servers to do so? Are we able to identify how much alcohol is going out the door and who's getting it, type thing? Children are becoming, attending more and more events as we progress in the industry. How are we addressing their needs in respect to that? And we're also shifting to a much older population with the baby boomers and their retirement. We've got 75 million baby boomers that are out there that could be attending the various meetings and events that we put on. How are we addressing that? ADA considerations are a big issue. Americans with disabilities at this point, it's a very growing or larger population, unfortunately, so we have to be doing more to accommodate them and their needs. Weather conditions, as you can see, weather has been a significant issue as of late. I mean, obviously, you got Hurricane Florence in the Carolinas, but you got a lot of time to plan for that. What about those types of events where you don't? You got some sort of weather event, meteorological event that might occur that's out of the blue. Are you prepared for that? Lightning storms, things like that, tornadoes. If you're out on the West Coast, you've got mudslides and you've got earthquakes that might result. So what are your planning procedures for these types of situations? You could go on down the list, as you can see, from permitting requirements. When you're putting on an event, are you addressing the permitting requirements? Are you pulling the special event requirements? Are you talking with the police departments? Do you have a management of transportation plan in place? Do you have the appropriate insurance? There's so many questions to ask, and I know it seems overwhelming, but that's why we start the timeline or the planning of these events so far out. At least we should. I mean, some instances 12 to 15 months out. If we're getting into a mega event, it might be years out. But that's really, that's why you come together and you make these determinations of what's appropriate for the event that we're going to hold, and who's going to be responsible for ensuring that all the I's get dotted and the T's get crossed, so to speak. So with that said, a lot of people in our industry don't realize that we have standards, and we have quite a few standards. The problem is they're not all in one spot. And we are working to change that behind the scenes at this point and try to create a cumulative, a one-stop shop for all the standards that apply to our industry. But at this point, it's not the case. Everything's piecemeal, and you can go all the way down from the municipal issues to your state considerations to your federal, to just standards, consensus standard committees that exist that have an impact in our business. Like I discussed earlier for NFPA, I mean, banquet seating. There's even rules about how you set up your banquet seating and how much space you have between the tables. So the fire marshal could come in and say, hey, you don't have the 54 inches between the chair back to the chair back in case there's an ingress-egress issue in the event of an emergency or a fire or something to that effect. So, I know that a lot of this is built into some of the software that we use out there, but if you're not using that software, these are some things that you should be familiar with. And if you are using the software, you should know why it's doing the things that it's doing. And I know a lot of times we have a tendency, when events grow or things change, we'll make last-minute additions or changes to the event location, and it changes the overall plan or the setup that we've got. And at that point, we might be in violation with some type of code or law or something to that effect. So NFPA 102 has to do with tent installations and temporary membrane structures. So, anytime you've got something larger than a 10 by 20, in most states, you're required to comply with the NFPA temporary membrane and tent structure laws. ASTM for surfaces, a lot of people don't realize that there's walking surfaces requirements for events. I know when we go into a meeting space or event and you've got audio-visual cables or something that affect that are running the length of a floor, going to a stage that's in the center, and you've got table, all around the stage. So, we'll use the plastic black and yellow, type devices to cover the cabling, and actually that is prohibited as well. because that right there is an obstruction. And it doesn't meet the code for a less than quarter-inch variance in the size of the surface before it becomes a trip hazard. So, at that point, we should either be burying these lines or flying them at some level, or coming up with an alternative to how the event is set up at some level, because we know that these are a significant trip hazard. I'm dealing with a matter where an individual got, the heel of their shoe stuck in one of the holes on one of those devices and caused a pretty significant injury as a result. So we've got to be taking those types of things into consideration. What seem like available options sometimes aren't the actual option. There's just another patch or a problem, so to speak. So many laws with respect to hospitality considerations. There's great textbooks out there, Serve Safe from alcohol perspectives. I could go on and on with respect to the standards that exist, but just know that if you can think it, there probably is something out there that addresses it, and it's our job as event planners, meeting planners, to find it. And if you can't find it, ask someone to help you with it, because there might be someone that knows where to look for it. So, all right. So I have a question here. It says, does Brian work with the EIC in developing these standards? I haven't been working with the EIC, but I have been working with other organizations and standards writing bodies such as ASTM. On creating standards for our industry. So I've been on that committee or board for quite a while, almost 20 years. So the goal is I've been working with MPI and some others to create additional standards. So there are so many options out there, and I think that that's another issue, is that whose do you rely on? And I think in the long run, everyone's going to have to come together and work on one single set of standards. There's a great guide out there for our industry called the Event Safety Alliance book, and it has a lot for live entertainment events. So it's not a one-stop shop in its entirety, but it is fairly decent for addressing a lot of these concerns that I'm bringing up today. So there's 5 elements of risk planning. As you can see, our job is to be proactive. That's not always plausible. Sometimes we have to be reactive in our approach because it's something that we just did not plan for or don't know. But like I said, that might not be an excuse. You still might be held accountable for it. But how well did you address the situation when it did come up so that it mitigated whatever potential losses could have been? So, with respect to that, you can see the safety, the insurance, the emergency training, contract security. It's the mix. With respect to what is you're responsible for doing when you're holding an event or a meeting. Safety sometimes is blended in with the rest because people really don't understand what safety is. They kind of will mistake it for either security or just business continuity plans, emergency considerations, and whatnot. But safety is really the proactive issue that you are going to consider with respect to potential injuries that might result from the things that we create, do, whatnot on the meetings and events that we host. So insurance obviously is pretty straightforward, but do you have the right kind? There's so many kinds out there. In fact, you can insure yourself out of business with the expenses associated with it. Insurance can get very expensive, and it might not be necessary in all aspects for what it is that you're trying to achieve or what it is that you're trying to insure or underwrite at some point. So it's important to have a person that understands our industry so that you can get the right insurance to cover you. And then obviously the contracts that we write, don't pull contracts offline and have a one-size-fit-all type approach. You really need to consult with an attorney when you're developing your contracts so they can be very, very specific to what it is that you've envisioned and address all the potential concerns that might arise as a result of the event that you've actually created. So now, security, just going back to that one last point there, very important. It's shifting the responsibilities in our industry. It used to be okay where you could just use a license D, or some sort of, registered company that provided security at some level or another, but no weapons or anything to that effect. But we've gotten to a point where you really need to have a police presence at most of your larger events in the event that something occurs so that you can react in an appropriate manner and in a timely manner. So things are really shifting in that regard. I know it's more expensive, but it's much better route, and it will protect all parties involved as we move forward through these difficult times, different events that have been targeted in the past. So, here are 5 things, pitfalls to avoid. Last-minute planning, changes that go unchecked, which I addressed a little bit earlier. Supervision, yes, you need to supervise, not necessarily as a babysitter, but it is your responsibility to monitor the event as it was intended and make sure that people are using it as you have designed. And that, communication and all those things factor into this, having policies and procedures and making sure everybody is educated in this regard so that no one winds up injured as a result of what's been provided for them. Site selection is very important. The purpose versus non-purpose built facilities, I see this quite a bit where, they find this wonderful non-purpose built type facility in some environment where it's just not conducive for the event that you've actually created or the meeting, and we try to do what we can to make it fit. Sometimes it's just good to walk away because there's a lot of unknowns associated with it. So that's not always the case. Sometimes it's very easy to manage and figure out a way to make it work, but at what cost? So activities, there are limitations to all activities that we provide. We're seeing an uptick in extreme sports and activities as of late. When you're providing these type of opportunities to guests, make sure that they understand everyone has limits. I know a lot of parties and stuff we see these days, bounce houses and whatnot, but what most don't know is that they're one of the most dangerous forms of activities that exist. I mean, if you've got jousting or Velcro walls and whatnot, in the last 10 years, there's been 113,000 accidents on them. So, know the limits of people and understand what it is that you're providing and make sure it's appropriate for the environment. Is there a general number that they would say an attendance threshold to determine if you need police presence? I have found as of late that there are charts and graphs and stuff like that the police departments are providing based on the event venues that they work. You could call your local police department based on the venue that you might be hosting an event, and they usually will have a scale that they use based on a number of people that are going to be attending, especially based on the area that they're attending at. So it is a very sliding scale. I have seen them, as an example, if you have 3,000 plus at an event, they would have 8 police with 1 sergeant or a person in authority or supervisor, and then each additional 1,000, they would have 1 more police officer and/or a series of security, like licensed D type security officers available. So that is one example. But yes, there are scales and whatnot out there that can assist with that process. So basically what I'm suggesting to you is integrate all your policies and practices. Make sure you analyze each situation. Research if you're unfamiliar with things. Address your findings with a plan, and most importantly, carry out your plan. It might not be the best plan, but at least that will lead you in a general direction to success. So what I have noticed throughout my experience is that people want to care, but sometimes it's too expensive. They don't have the time. They're not capable. But we have to understand these excuses or gaps, they're not going to fly moving forward. As you see there in the quote, it says, a lack of foreseeability is construed as a failure to do and know your job. So as event planners, meeting planners, we're supposed to be experts in this field. So it is our general duty to make sure that we fill these gaps and understand where the problems might lie so that people remain safe. So that is it for me. I appreciate your time today. Hopefully you guys have learned a few things, and if you've got any additional questions, please let me know.
Thank you, Brian.
Yes, thank you.
We have some questions in the Q&A box. One, someone wants to know, do you work for the EIC in developing those standards that you were talking about?
No, the Events Industry Council, is that what I'm understanding, the EIC?
Yes.
No, I've been working with MPI specifically, and then I've been working with ASTM which is a general standards writing committee. And I've also worked with ANSI, which is the American National Standards Institute. Ultimately, once the industry agrees on a set of standards, the objective would be to submit them to a standard writing body, such as ASTM or ANSI or something like that, and go through the process to receive approval and then general consensus of those standards, so that they can start to be adopted state by state or by municipalities and things like that. So we do have a long way to go, but we are making progress in that regard.
Okay. Someone also asked, is there a general number that you would say is an attendance threshold to determine if you need a police presence?
Yes, so I touched on that question. I believe I answered it, but if you want some additional clarity, yes, the police departments, usually in the locations where you're going to be hosting your event, they're most familiar with the venues and or the demographic makeup of the environment in which that event or venue is going to be. They will give you an exact number, but there are, as I said, in example, say you had 3,000 individuals that were attending a venue, they might recommend that you have 8 police officers and then a supervisor or a sergeant, and for each additional 1,000, an additional police officer. Plus, they're going to encourage that you have some licensed D type security guards as well.
Okay. All right. If we don't have any more questions from anyone, we'll wait a few seconds. I know sometimes you type them in and maybe a bit. All right. Well, if we have no further questions, I want to thank Brian again for sharing with us today. After this webinar concludes, you will be directed to a short survey, so if you could fill that out, that would be great for us to get some feedback.
Yes.
Just a few questions. I think we had one more question come in, Brian. Someone said, I had no idea about needing a crowd certified person on site for crowds above 250. Do you recommend that the event planner, or do you recommend that be the event planner or someone else?
Yes, so every event planner that is producing an event should go through this process and learn the requirements per NFPA. So that is your baseline. So outside of that, you could use an organization like CSC or something to that effect, where all their crowd managers are certified in this regard, and bring them in to assist in this capacity. Usually any licensed D type security officers from a state will be licensed in this regard as well. So you just got to know, and the police obviously are going to know this. The fire marshals or any fire watch, depending on the type of event, will have these people certified as well. So you just have to know who it is that you're requiring for your event, and then start to do a hard count on how many people you've got, and then make a determination, do I have enough coverage based on what the requirements are? And what is NFPA? That's a great question. I see that as well. That's the National Fire Protection Association, and they have standards for, like, their life safety code standards. And if you want to be real specific about where to find what I'm talking about, it's in chapters 12 and 13 under the assembly occupancies requirements. So anytime you have an assembly other than for religious purposes, there is a requirement for assembly with respect to how many certified crowd safety managers are required. So if you got a hold of the NFPA documents and you typed in crowd, it would come up. I think it's on page 148 of the chapter. So that's where you look for that.
All right, and we have one more question, Brian. Someone wants to know, how does someone get crowd control certified?
So you would reach out to your local fire marshal and ask, do they provide the training? If not, there is an online option to the International Venue Management Association. They do an online training. I think it's $15, and I think it takes 4 hours, and then you're good. And I see WhatIf is a faith-based organization. Any religious organizations do not have to comply with NFPA. There's an exemption for assembly occupancies in that regard.
All Thank you, Brian. So, you can learn about our past and upcoming webinars on all of our websites listed on the screen now. For those of you watching live today, the CMP credit is pending approval from the EIC. Once the credit is approved, we will email your certificate of attendance. Again, if you're watching on demand, please email me for your certificate. It will not come to you automatically. If you have any questions about this webinar, you can email me at cmore@connectmeetings.com, and I have just typed it in the chat box for you to see. We hope you'll join us again October 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Standard Time for another informative session on cybersecurity with Connect speaker Michael Owen. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great day.
Thank you.